There is a parable in the Gospel of Luke that almost nobody reads correctly. Most people hear it and think it is about nagging God into action. They hear it and assume the lesson is simple. Pray harder, pray longer, pray louder, and eventually God will give in. But that reading misses something fundamental, something hidden in the structure of the story itself, something Jesus placed there deliberately, a contrast so sharp it cuts to the bone once you finally see it. Because this is not a parable about pestering God. This is a parable about what kind of God you actually believe in. And once you understand that, once you read this story the way the original audience would have heard it, everything changes. The prayer life you have been struggling with begins to make sense. The silence you have been interpreting as rejection starts to look like something else entirely. And the question Jesus asks at the very end of the parable, the one most readers breeze past, becomes the most haunting question in the entire New Testament. We need to go slowly here, because there is a secret buried in this story that most Christians have never been told. Luke chapter 18, verse 1. The text opens with something unusual, a narrator's note. Luke, writing with careful precision, tells us why Jesus told this parable before Jesus even begins telling it. He says Jesus spoke this parable to show that men ought always to pray and not to faint. Read that carefully. Always pray, do not faint. The word faint in the original Greek is the word enkakeo. It comes from two roots, en meaning in and kakos meaning evil or bad. Together, the word carries the sense of losing heart, growing weary, becoming cowardly in the face of opposition. It is the feeling that rises when you have been praying for something important, something you know matters, and nothing seems to be moving. It is the quiet, corrosive thought that whispers, "Why are you still doing this? Nothing is happening. Maybe God is not listening. Maybe God does not care." Luke is telling us up front, this parable exists to fight that feeling. It does not exist to teach a technique for prayer. It exists to treat a disease of the soul. Now we can enter the story.
In the ancient Jewish world, this description is not merely character background. It is a total moral diagnosis delivered in a single sentence. A judge in first-century Israel was not simply a legal official. He was a representative of divine justice. The entire Hebrew legal system was built on the idea that God himself was the ultimate judge, and that human judges functioned as his delegates, his representatives on earth. The book of Deuteronomy is explicit about this. Moses instructs the judges of Israel, "You shall not show partiality, for the judgment is God's." So when Jesus introduces a judge who neither fears God nor regards man, he is describing someone who has broken his relationship with both the vertical and the horizontal. He has severed himself from accountability to heaven and accountability to his community at the same time. He is a man who judges purely for himself. The original audience would have felt an immediate revulsion at this figure. This is a corrupt judge, an unjust judge, the worst possible version of the institution that was supposed to protect the vulnerable. And the widow comes to him. She had a case. The text doesn't tell us what the case was, which is itself significant. We are not supposed to focus on the details of her legal dispute. We are supposed to focus on who she is. In the ancient Near East, widows occupied a uniquely precarious position. The Hebrew word for widow is almanah, and scholars have noted that the root of this word may relate to the concept of muteness or silence, the one who has no voice. In a society where legal standing was largely tied to male household headship, a widow had no natural advocate. She was exposed. She was isolated. She had no political connections, no financial leverage, no family structure to pressure the system on her behalf. In the Torah, God describes himself specifically as the defender of widows and orphans. The entire legal and ethical architecture of ancient Israel was designed to protect people exactly like this woman. But this judge has broken that architecture. And so she comes to him, repeatedly, relentlessly. The Greek word used to describe her coming back is erkoma. She kept coming. This is an imperfect tense verb, indicating ongoing, repeated action. She was not a one-time visitor. She was persistent in a way that refused to accept the silence of an unjust system as the final word.
And then the judge speaks his soliloquy. This is one of the most remarkable moments in all of Jesus' parables, a villain giving a window into his own mind. "Though I do not fear God, nor regard man, yet because this widow bothers me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me." The word translated weary me, this is where it gets fascinating. The Greek word is hypopiazo. In classical Greek, this word was a boxing term. It meant to strike someone under the eye, to give them a black eye,
to bruise their face. This unjust judge is not saying he is emotionally exhausted. He is using the language of physical combat. He is saying, "This woman is beating me. She is wearing me out the way a fighter wears down an opponent. And if I do not act, she is going to leave a mark on my reputation that I cannot undo." The widow's persistence is not a polite, deferential plea. It is an act of relentless, society-defying courage. She is a woman with no power fighting a man with every power, and she is winning through sheer refusal to disappear. That detail changes everything about how we read this story. Now, Jesus turns to his disciples. Hear what the unjust judge said. He is asking them to hold that image, to fix it in their minds, the corrupt judge, the persistent widow, the eventual grudging victory. And then Jesus does something that transforms the entire parable.
He argues from the lesser to the greater. Shall not God avenge his own elect, who cry day and night to him, though he bears long with them? Read that phrase carefully, though he bears long with them. This is not describing God as reluctant. This is describing God as long-suffering. The Greek word here is makrothumeo, to be long-tempered, to be slow to anger, to endure with great patience. The contrast Jesus is drawing is not between a reluctant God and a persistent prayer. The contrast is between an unjust judge who does not care and a God who cares immeasurably more. Between a judge who finally acts to protect his own reputation and a God who will certainly act because his people are his own elect. Between a cold legal system and a living, faithful Father. Jesus is not saying, God is like the unjust judge, so keep annoying him. Jesus is saying, if even this corrupt judge with no love in his heart eventually produces justice for a persistent widow, how much more certainly will your God, who is none of those things, who loves you, who chose you, who is faithful and just by nature, bring justice for the ones who cry to him.
But there is something else here that almost nobody talks about. Go back to the phrase, though he bears long with them. In most readings, this phrase is applied to God bearing long with human sin, or bearing long with the delay of judgment. But several careful scholars have noted that the grammar here is unusual. It could also be read as God bearing patiently with the very prayers of his people, with the cries, with the repetition, with the desperate, sometimes incoherent, night and day calling. If that reading is correct, and the Greek allows it, then what Jesus is describing is not God waiting for his people to pray enough times before he acts. What Jesus is describing is God listening patiently, lovingly, with full attention, as his people cry out in the night. The long suffering is not delay as punishment. It is the patience of a father who is not bored by the 10,000th repetition of a desperate prayer. That is a different God than the one most people are praying to. Let's pause and sit with this for a moment.
Because most people who have been praying about something for a long time have built up a story about why God hasn't answered. The story usually goes one of a few directions. Either God hasn't heard, or God heard and doesn't care, or God is waiting for something, some condition of faith, some level of purity, some numerical threshold of prayers. All of those stories make God reactive. They make God a passive responder to human performance. They reconstruct the unjust judge into the image of God himself. And this is precisely what Jesus is dismantling. The parable says, you are looking at the wrong thing. Do not model your theology of prayer on an unjust judge and his conditions. Look at who God actually is. Look at his character. Look at his covenant. Look at the nature of the one you are actually speaking to when you pray. And when you see God clearly, when you trade the image of a reluctant judge for the image of a faithful father, something happens to the quality of your waiting. It doesn't feel the same. The silence doesn't read the same. The unanswered petition stops feeling like rejection and starts feeling like a place where faith is being built. Now we reach the final verse, and this is the part most people forget entirely. Jesus ends the parable not with a proclamation, he ends it with a question. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, shall he find faith on the earth? Read that slowly. Jesus just told a story about the certainty of God's justice. He just gave his disciples a theological argument for why they should pray and not lose heart.
He just made the case that God is good and faithful and will absolutely avenge his elect. And then, in the very last breath of the parable, he raises a doubt. Not a doubt about God, a doubt about us. Shall he find faith on the earth? The Greek word for faith here is pistis, which carries a meaning that extends beyond intellectual belief. It means trust, continued trust, relational faithfulness, the kind of faith that holds on to what it knows about God even when the visible evidence seems to contradict it. Jesus is not asking whether people will still be religious when he returns. He is asking whether they will still be trusting, whether the long night of waiting will have produced in them the same quality of stubborn, widow-like persistence, or whether they will have drifted into the posture of the unjust judge's city, where no one advocates for themselves because no one really believes justice is possible. That is an uncomfortable question to sit with.
Because most of us know what it feels like to have our prayers outlast our faith, to still speak the words but quietly stop expecting anything to change, to maintain the posture of prayer while abandoning the trust that animated it. This is the disease Luke warned about in verse 1. This is what it means to faint. But notice what the question implies about the answer. Jesus would not ask whether he will find faith on the earth if faith were inevitable. The question is not rhetorical in a comfortable direction. It carries the genuine weight of uncertainty, not about God's ability to answer, but about humanity's capacity to keep trusting through the long silence. And this is where the widow comes back in with fresh power. She did not know the judge would eventually respond. She had no guarantee of outcome. She had no promise written down, no vision, no prophetic word confirming her persistence would be rewarded. She had nothing but the sense that her case was just, and that silence was not the same as defeat. Her persistence was itself an act of belief, not belief that she had performed enough repetitions to unlock a result, belief that justice existed and could be reached, belief that the system, even this corrupt version of it, still had access to the possibility of right outcomes. What Jesus is asking his disciples is whether they will be that kind of people when he returns, whether they will still be widows who trust the possibility of justice, even in a city run by unjust judges, whether they will have maintained the theological conviction that God is good, even when the evidence on the ground has been difficult for a very long time.
There is a historical layer to this parable that most modern readers miss almost entirely. Jesus is speaking to disciples who are about to enter one of the most violent, destabilizing periods in the history of the Jewish people. Within a generation, Jerusalem would be surrounded by Roman armies. The temple would be destroyed. The very geography of their faith would be dismantled. When Jesus asks whether he will find faith when he returns, he is speaking into that approaching darkness. He is asking, when everything you trusted in externally has been taken away, the temple, the city, the structures, will you still trust me? Will you still cry day and night? Will you still be the widow who refuses to accept that the case is closed? The parable is not merely about individual prayer requests. It is about the disposition of a whole people across the long sweep of history. It is about what it looks like to live by faith in an age that does not cooperate with faith. It is about whether the community of believers will hold its theological nerve when the visible evidence stops being friendly. And this is where the story becomes deeply personal. Because most of us who have been following Jesus for any length of time have had seasons where the visible evidence stopped being friendly. Seasons of illness, of loss, of injustice that was not corrected, of prayers that were faithful and sincere and yet seemed to produce nothing. These are the moments when the parable speaks at its deepest register, not as a technique for unlocking answered prayer, not as a strategy for managing God, but as an invitation to examine the image of God we are praying to.
Are you praying to the unjust judge, a figure you must wear down through sufficient persistence before he will condescend to notice you? Or are you praying to the one Jesus describes, a God who hears, who cares, who is not unmoved by the cry of his elect, who bears long with their prayers, not because he is reluctant, but because he is patient, and who will certainly bring justice at the right time? The quality of your waiting depends entirely on the answer to that question. There is one more detail worth noticing before we close. Luke tells us at the beginning that Jesus told this parable to show that men ought always to pray and not faint.
And then Jesus tells a story, not about a triumphant prayer warrior, but about a widow, a poor woman, a person without status, without leverage, without any obvious reason for confidence that the system would work in her favor. That is not accidental. Jesus consistently chose the marginalized figure as his example of exemplary faith. The woman with the lost coin, the prodigal who comes to his senses in a pigsty, the Samaritan who stops on the road, and here, the widow who refuses to stop coming. What this tells us is that persistent, faithful prayer is not the exclusive property of the theologically sophisticated or the spiritually experienced. It is the birthright of anyone who knows their need and trusts that the one they are coming to is good. You do not need a polished prayer language. You do not need a perfect theology. You need the widow's conviction, the settled sense that the case is worth bringing, that the judge is worth approaching, and that silence from heaven is not the same as absence in heaven.
Now we return to where we began. The question underneath this parable was never, how many times do I need to pray before God answers? The real question was always, what do you actually believe about God when you pray? Do you believe you are approaching a reluctant administrator who must be worn down? Or do you believe you are approaching the one who called you his own, who hears the cry of his elect, who is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and who will certainly act at the right time? The widow's secret was not persistence as a technique, it was persistence as theology. Her refusal to stop coming was an expression of what she believed about the nature of justice itself, that it existed, that it could be reached, that she had a case worth bringing. And Jesus looked at his disciples, people about to walk into extraordinary difficulty, people who would need to pray through things they could not control, people who would watch the visible structures of their world collapse, and he told them a story about a widow. He said, "Be like her." Not because God is like the unjust judge, but because you have access to something far greater than she did. You are not coming to a corrupt official in a broken city. You are coming to a Father, the one who built justice into the fabric of the universe and who will see to it that the universe bends, eventually, toward what is right. And when everything in your life makes you want to stop coming, come anyway. The question is not whether he will answer. The question is whether, when he does, he will still find you trusting.